So all of chapter 5, you just learned how to factor all trinomials. Anyway, now we're going to actually see what we use factoring for. So when you were given a trinomial and we factored it into this. Well, if it's an equation, so now it has an equal sign, and we set it equal to 0, we can solve. So now your directions won't say factor, they will say solve. And to start out with, they're kind of nice and they factor it for you. And all you have to do is think, if this parentheses was 0, 0 times this, whatever it is, would equal 0. And vice versa. So all you have to do is take each factor and set it equal to 0 and solve. So you just need to figure out if I add 3 to both sides, that would make that 0, wouldn't it? 3 subtract 3 would be 0, and 0 times this would be 0. So 3 is the solution. And here, if I subtract 5 from both sides, I would get -5 is the solution. So those are your two answers to this problem. And in my math lab, they just list them. They probably go smallest to largest, so they would just look like that. And we know technically we're telling them that that's what x equals. Now, suppose you saw something like this. It's factored, and so you might be tempted to set each factor equal to 0 like we did here. But the difference is this is not equal to 0. This is equal to -2. So by setting the factors equal to 0 and solving, we still wouldn't know when it equals -2. We would know when it equals 0. So that's your first step. So since in this case I don't know if I'll need to combine that with something in the parentheses, I'll begin by distributing. So I'm going to distribute that x all the way through the parentheses. And then, well, I'll write it. And then the next step, I'll go ahead and add 2 to combine it with anything. So we just put +2. Now it's equal to 0. Now you can factor. So now all this work you've spent factoring comes into play. And you know that the only thing that can be 5 is 5x and x, so that's good. And I can see that 5 and 2 will add up to 7. So I'm going to put my 2 here. So I have my inside times my inside is 2x, and my outside times my outside is 5x. And we know that that's 2 times 1. And I know that if this is positive, I either have to have both plus signs or both negatives, because a negative times a negative would be positive. And the outside and the inside have to add up to -7x. So let's make them both negative. For checking that, I would have inside times the inside is -2x to -7x. So we factored it correctly. Now factor and set it equal to 0. And I know if one of those factors is 0, 0 times the other one is also 0. So I just solve for x. I will add 2 to both sides, and I will divide both sides by 5. And right here, add 1 to both sides. So those are our two solutions. Let's see. What if you see a fraction in your homework? Fractions are nearly impossible to factor. And so if you're trying to factor and you're dealing with a fraction, I would absolutely just begin the problem by getting rid of that. And we've done that a few times this semester. So as a reminder, you just look at the whole equation, and you have to have an equal sign. So you look at every denominator on both sides of the equal sign and figure out the least common denominator. So the smallest thing that 1 and 2 and 1 will all go into is 2. So I'm just going to multiply, and I will use red, and what I've seen some students do is just stick it in a box so they remember that they're putting this into the problem. But we're going to multiply everything by 2. And what that will do here is cancel that fraction. So we'll have an equivalent equation. It's the same line, or same parabola actually, but the same graph, the same equation, but we no longer have to deal with fractions. So 5 times x is 5x, 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 2 is 6. Now we know we never factor, we never solve until it's equal to 0. Never factor until go ahead and factor. And this one you could have 2 and 2, 4 and 1, 2 and 3, 6 and 1. So it might be a good one to review factoring by grouping. So if we want to factor by grouping, remember that we multiply 4 times negative 6. So I would have negative 24. And then I would start breaking that down. So what times what is 24? We've got 8 and 3, 6 and 4, 12 and 2, 24 and 1. And then I look at those factors, and I know that to be negative, one of these has to be negative, and one of them has to be positive. So one of them is negative and one of them is positive. So I'm taking the difference of them has a difference of 3. And oh, I can see that 8 and 3 have a difference of 5. Did I say 3? 5. Alright, so I'm going to rewrite my equation, and I'm going to make sure that it's 3x. And that way I know that they would multiply, and I also know that positive 8 and negative 3 add up to 5. So I can replace 5. Alright, copying down the 6. Now we have this. Now we'll factor by grouping. So out of that one, I can take a 4 and a divide. I just have x here. And if I divide by 4x, I just have 2 there. Now we're going to factor those two. And I can see that I can take a 3 out of both of them. And I want them to be positive. I want to have positive x and positive 2. So I'm going to take a negative x, and if I divide by negative 3, it will give me a positive 2. Still equal to 0. Now pull that common factor out. So I'm going to pull x plus 2 out of both terms, leaving me 4x minus 3. Alright, now set each factor equal to 0 and solve. And so I will just subtract 2 from both sides, and I'm done with that one. Here I have to add 3 and divide by 4. So we get those two solutions. Those are my answers. And those are, it's kind of tricky with a fraction, but if I were on a test, I might actually take the time to stick those in for without a doubt that I'm right. Alright, what if I saw this problem? My pen looks like it's running out. Alright, first of all, we know that we have to set it equal to 0. So let's begin by doing that. And we like to factor with our leading term, our highest exponent, positive. So I'm going to subtract x squared, and I'm going to subtract, now it's equal to 0. Now, we haven't seen this a lot, but the first thing you should always do before you factor, like we did here, is look for a common factor. And you can see the common factor in this case is x. So I'm going to take x out of the whole thing. So if I divide each term by x, I am left with that. Now we're going to factor. And this one's not too bad, so we can do it with trial and error. We know that the only thing that will be x squared is x times x. And then for 6, we could have 6 times 1 or 3 times 2. But the signs are different. One of them's positive, one of them's negative. And so I know the difference needs to be 1. That tells me I've got to use 3 and 2. So 3 and 2. And the bigger one has to be the negative. So the 3 is negative and the 2 is positive. Now this is really important. Right here I actually have 3 factors. And because this has a variable in it, I set that equal to 0 as well. Because if this is 0, if x was 0, 0 times this and this would equal 0. So that is actually a solution. X equals 0. Here, I set x minus 3 equal to 0. And here, x plus 2 equal to 0. So, solving, I get this. So I have 3 solutions. And that's common when you have x to the third, because you can have up to that many solutions. Okay, last one. How about this one? X to the third minus 7x squared minus 4x plus 28. And they were nice, and they already set it equal to 0 for us. But as soon as I see 4 terms, I know, oh, I'm going to factor by grouping, just like we learned earlier in chapter 5. So I'm going to group it in the order it's in and see if it'll work. Remember, that means divide, leaving me 1x here and negative 7 here. Right here, I'm going to go ahead and factor. Because I want the signs to match up, I'm going to take out a negative 4, because then that will give me positive x, and look, negative 7. So that's important that you keep that sign right, because that makes those the same. Then I can factor that like part of the 2 terms out, leaving me x squared minus 4. Now I like this one, because perfect square and a perfect square, this is a difference of squares. So this will go even further. And it will factor into x plus and x minus the square root, which in this case is 2. So I have 3 factors now, and they're all equal to 0. So solving those, we know we get 7, negative 2, and positive 2. So again, we have 3 answers, which we thought was likely because it was x to the 3rd. So now you put all your factoring methods together and you go one more step and just set them equal to 0 and solve. So good luck.